Jonathan Chapman, who's an associate professor at the University of Bologna. Obviously, it's a co-author piece, but Jonathan will be presenting Justices of the Peace, Legal Foundations of the Industrial Revolution. And I'm told I'm supposed to remind the audience of the rules of engagement, which is that questions can only be asked in the Q&A space. That one should flag clarification questions in the Q&A space as hashtag clarification, and that only the moderators will be able to stop the presenter for clarification questions. So other than that, it's my great pleasure to hand things over to Jonathan Chapman.
Thank you very much. Hopefully you're seeing my slides, I think. Yes?
Not yet.
I need to share them again?
Yes, please.
I see. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so hi everyone. So thank you, Steve. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me here, and thank you everyone for joining. So hopefully you can see the slides now. So this is joint work with Tim Besley, Dan Bogart, and Nuno Palma, and it's a paper looking at state capacity during the Industrial Revolution period. And the sort of motivation or the starting point for the paper is the idea that today high state capacity is seen as critical to economic growth. So if a government can't achieve its goals, that's seen as somehow impeding economic development. But this is in some contrast or some tension with the fact that in the Industrial Revolution period, the state has generally been portrayed as a best passive, not getting in the way of economic development, and in some stories, even blocking development. And more generally, we can think that states in the 18th or even earlier centuries were relatively weak by today's standards. So the British state in 1700, for instance, spent less than 10% of GDP, and it didn't have a paid police force. So what we do in this paper is argue that the contribution of the state has actually been underappreciated in the Industrial Revolution in Britain, and in particular, the contribution of legal capacity, that is, the state's ability to enforce laws, has been underappreciated. And we're going to argue that that's been underappreciated because a particular form of street-level legal capacity has largely been overlooked in the social science literature. And in particular, we study legal capacity in a particular form, which is the justices of the peace in England. So the justices of the peace are unpaid magistrates, and uniquely in Europe, Britain was relying on these unpaid magistrates to enforce a range of laws during the Industrial Revolution period. So the office of the Justices of the Peace was established in 1361 during the reign of Edward III. Initially, this office, or these JPs, are focused on maintaining the peace, stopping riots, making sure that people don't revolt. But over time, they become a very flexible form of state capacity that are used to enforce a huge range of laws, including many that are fundamental to the workings of a market economy. So things like enforcing property rights, enforcing contracts, implementing regulations, and many of the things that they did could be seen as underpinning fiscal capacity, like making decisions that affect the ability for the state to raise taxes. And so this is a picture of how the justices were seen, for instance, in the 17th century. So here is the justice sitting on the throne, and there is the idea that this is a local miniature of the sovereign. So at this point in time, these JPs were really the arm of the crown and later parliament outside of London. The ability for the state to project its power outside of the capital was through these JPs. So here the JP is administering the wisdom of Solomon, and they probably didn't have quite this range of powers, but they did have a huge range of power. And they did adjudicate a huge range of types of cases, ranging all the way up to some of the most serious cases by the end of the 18th century. So our first contribution, sort of building here, is just to document exactly that these JPs were a core aspect of state capacity. So the general picture we're going to be looking at the paper is thinking of JPs as state capacity and their impact on economic growth. We're going to be looking at the effect of JPs in 1700, growth over the next 140 years. But what we see on this side first is I want to look at how we think of JPs as state capacity. And to do so, we're comparing the growth of parliamentary acts, which is the red line, to the growth of parliamentary acts, which we link to JPs. And this is an index, and you can see that the two series grow sort of hand in hand, essentially. So as the parliament begins to pass new laws, they pass more power to the JPs. They rely on the JPs to enforce those laws. We can see that this begins to diverge a little bit at the end of the century. This is reflecting the fact that by 1800, the state is beginning to move to new forms of state capacity. Obviously, this process is endogenous, which is why we focus for our causal analysis on JPs in 1700. And we're going to look at the development, particularly of population density, as a proxy for economic growth over the period of the Industrial Revolution. So you can see here that population grows very much in line with GDP per capita through the 18th and into the 19th centuries. We see the start of the classic Industrial Revolution period around 1760, when growth begins to move up at a sort of more sustained pace. And key to our argument is going to be that this increase in growth could not be observed at the beginning of the 18th century. We're also going to look at other changes in the economy that occurred as part of the Industrial Revolution. So the left-hand side of this slide is the same as the previous slide, but here we're looking at different outcomes that we'll be investigating, which include the growth of innovation through patents. You can see this also takes off in the 18th and 19th centuries, and structural transformation out of agriculture and into other secondary and tertiary occupations. Again, you can see that the share in agriculture is relatively flat until around 1750, and then we see a decline in the workforce in agriculture. So the analysis that we're going to develop in this paper is set up to tackle some of the difficulties of identifying the long-term effects of state capacity on economic development. Generally, identifying this relationship is difficult because state capacity and economic growth tend to go hand in hand. A richer state can afford more investments in legal but also fiscal capacity. We're going to get around this problem by exploiting the fact there was a lot of variation across England and Wales in access to JPs at the turn of the 18th century. And critically for our identification story is that at the turn of the 18th century, the distribution of JPs around the country was determined not by anything that could affect economic growth in the future. To the extent, so essentially what we're going to be assuming is that the distribution of JPs in 1700 is driven by factors that are orthogonal to future economic development, conditional on some control variables. And critically, at this point, the number of JPs was decided not based on the contribution to the economy, and in particular, at a point when the changes associated with the Industrial Revolution were not only unforeseen, but also unimaginable. And we're going to study effects over a long time horizon, so over 150 years, on the basis that we can examine whether state capacity can essentially kickstart a development process in which initial growth may feed back into other productive investments in capacity, but also innovation and other changes that then drive future economic growth and future capacity investments. So the heterogeneity I'm speaking about is this. So our main variable of interest is going to be the number of JPs at county level in 1700. You can see here on the left-hand side of this diagram, there's a lot of variation in the number of JPs in different counties. So counties in the south around London tended to have a lot of JPs. See, Lancashire had a relatively large number of JPs, but around 100 in this case. But other areas, such as Wales in particular, which had few JPs partly for historical reasons, because Wales was not, at this point, fully integrated into England after the conquest, and also Northern England had very few JPs. And we're going to see that this restricted or slowed down economic growth. The other variable that we will use is identifying whether towns had a resident JP in 1680. So each of the dots on the right-hand side here refers to a market town. If they're hollow circles, this means there was no JP. If there was a JP, then it's a black diamond. And you can see there's a lot of variation across the country, but also within counties that we can use to support the causal interpretation of our findings. So in one figure, the story I'm going to lead you through is going to look like this. So, and both of these panels, the x-axis is the number of JPs in 1700 logged. On the y-axis, we have the change in log density. On the left-hand side, I have the log density change between 1600 and 1700. You can see very little is going on. The line is flat. And this is telling you, first, that not much is happening in the economy before 1700. Second, that to the extent it was happening, it wasn't in any way correlated with the number of JPs at the end of the century. This is consistent with the argument that I began to lay out to you, that the number of JPs is not being determined by underlying growth or factors that might drive growth in the economy before 1700. On the right-hand panel, we look at what happens after 1700. And here we can see that there's a clear upward sloping relationship. Counties with more JPs at the turn of the 18th century experience faster growth in population density over the following 100 years. So essentially, what we're seeing, or what we're arguing, is the number of JPs selected at this point in 1700 was orthogonal to future growth. Counties that had more JPs and hence more legal capacity through the 18th century experienced faster growth, because at this point, the existence of legal capacity became a key factor underpinning growth during the Industrial Revolution. So before I go through this argument in more details, the three takeaways I'm hoping that you'll take from today's seminar are these. So first, I think I've said this several times already, that legal capacity was key to shaping the Industrial Revolution. Secondly, I want you to think about the fact that early modern rulers faced this constraint that as growth began to take off, they couldn't set up a modern bureaucracy very fast. So they had to rely on these pre-existing structures, in this case in Britain, the JPs. And third, a broader and less historical contribution is to think about the importance of street-level legal institutions, such as JPs, alongside broad legal architecture studied, for instance, in the legal origins literature. So first, I'll give you some more details on the justices, and then we'll go through the empirical strategy. So as I said, the justices of the peace you can think of in the 17th and early 18th centuries as essentially the rulers of the county. So JPs were appointed for a particular county, of which there were 54 across England and Wales. Initially, they're appointed to maintain the peace, but they then have to do a range of different tasks. So throughout the 17th century, they become more and more important. And so there's a quote here from Norma Landau, as she says, they gradually acquired a near monopoly of local judicial and administrative authority. By the late 17th century, most other courts were either non-existent or insignificant. No local court now contested the justices' local rule. Sorry. Sorry, 1 second. Sorry about that. So the JP still exists today, but they became less important after the 1830s. So the period we're going to be studying will be between 1700 and 1840. So what did the JPs do? Well, they acted at three different levels. At one level, they acted at county level in what were called quarter sessions. Quarter sessions were courts, but these tried not only criminal cases, but also involved administration, such as managing county taxes. Justices also act outside of these quarter sessions in what were called petty sessions. These were smaller courts where you still needed 2 or more justices. These were relatively informal. And then third, justices can make decisions independently wherever they were in a county alone. This was known as summary justice. So in quarter sessions, you needed all the JPs to sit together. These happened 4 times a year. And these other sessions could happen throughout a year and were accessible throughout a whole county. And the JPs in these different roles did a huge range of different things. And it's impossible to really summarize this very quickly. What we do in the paper, and I can talk more about in the Q&A if we have time, is provide a summary of all the different things they did through looking at their tasks in what were called manuals. These manuals were things that the JPs used to identify what they had to do. And what we see is that their tasks become increasingly economic through the 18th century. So they do a lot of things such as regulation, such as enforcing contracts, taxation, building infrastructure, things that you would expect to be important to economic development. So just to give you a couple of examples of the kinds of things the JPs were doing. So here is one entry from the manuals. So this is coin. We can see that here we see one justice. This is summary justice. On complaint upon oath, there is just cause that any person hath been concerned in counterfeiting the copy monies of this realm may by his warrant cause the dwelling house, room, workshop, etc. to be used. And this, you can see already, coin or counterfeiting is clearly important to economic activities. You can also see the kind of things that were important about the JPs as they had these specific powers, such as the use of warrants that allowed them to do things that maybe other local actors or legal actors couldn't do. Another role of the JPs, which we can see highlighted here, is in enforcing regulation. So the regulation here is in bricks and tiles. So this is the rule they had to implement, that every plain tile shall be 10.5 inches long, 6 inches broad, 1/2 inch and 1/4 quarter thick. So again, this is enforcing the kind of regulations that underpin market transactions. So the JPs had all of these powers, had these roles. They also had a lot of autonomy. So this is arguably one of the institution's strengths. They could apply what in Britain is often called sort of common sense in making decisions. But they couldn't purely do whatever they like. There were both formal institutions and informal norms that kept them in check somewhat. So throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, we saw the fact that JPs often had to act in a pair or more in petty sessions. They could be removed from the bench if they misbehaved, although we see little evidence this happened in practice. In any case, if a JP made a decision, their decision could be reviewed at quarter sessions in front of all of the justices, and civil cases could be brought against the JPs if they were seen to have made bad decisions or illegal decisions. Underpinning all of this, I would argue, is the fact that there were these social norms of gentlemanly conduct. So as we're going to see a bit more evidence of, JPs were constrained by social norms and property requirements to come from relatively wealthy families, from elites. This means they were motivated a lot more by status than by cash. And this is consistent with generally gentlemanly norms of 18th century elites that have been highlighted by, for instance, Joel McKeer, amongst others. So these norms and the sort of perception they should be seen to be acting as a gentleman constrain them from acting in a pure rent-seeking fashion. So the rest of the talk is going to be based about trying to convince you that, or test, but hopefully convince you, that the JPs contributed to economic development during the critical period of the Industrial Revolution. And so we're going to be studying economic development between around the Glorious Revolution in 1700 and the Age of Reform in 1830s, when the JPs lost much of their power. So this is really the era when the JP was the primary legal arm of the state in the provinces. And as I already said, we'll be leveraging this heterogeneity at the start of this period. So variation in the number of JPs in 1700 and the presence of a resident JP in different towns in 1680. To do this, we're drawing on a new data set that we've assembled of both county level and town level JPs. So at county level, we collect JPs, we identify the number of JPs, both from secondary sources. So Norma Landau has a lot of data of the number of JPs. We then did a sort of very big archival source to identify anything else we could find. So we found another 9 lists of JPs which exist in this period. And then we fill in a gap for Lancashire using data from Besley. For 1680, what we can do is take the list of JPs and match it to a list of elites from Bologna in 1673. And this allows us to identify who these elites were and critically identify which towns had JPs living in them and which towns didn't. And this will give us a level of really local legal capacity. This is showing you an example of a list of JPs. So you can see basically what we're doing is first we exclude people who are seen as honorary JPs, who are people like the Duke of Bedford. This is consistent with the previous historical literature, which says that these people didn't actually act as JPs. They were there put on the name for honorary purposes. And then we're just going to count all of the other names of people on the list. Our basic empirical framework is then going to look like this. So we're going to have some outcomes which are generally measured in the mid-19th century. We're always going to be controlling for population density in 1700. This is a measure of pre-existing economic development before the Industrial Revolution. Then our main variable of interest will be the log number of JPs in a county in 1700. And we're going to control for a set of various other things. In our baseline specifications, we'll control for, as well as log population density, the amount of coal in a county, and a second order polynomial in longitude and latitude to account for potential spatial issues confounding our results. Then we'll add various other checks as robustness, although I may not have time to talk about that today. We're going to combine the data that we have on the JPs with a range of other things. So our main variable capturing economic development will be population density. Then we have a range of other development outcomes that hopefully I'll have time to talk about. I want to highlight just one here that we collected for this project, which is a data set of county level spending on various things between 1750 and 1840. So this is another new data set of local state capacity that is one contribution of this project alongside the measures of local legal capacity. Before going to the results, though, I want to spend some more time thinking about where this number of JPs comes from. So I told you there's a lot of heterogeneity, but I didn't really tell you where it comes from. And of course, this is critical in thinking about whether I can convince you or whether this relationship between the legal capacity and economic development is plausibly causal. So our assumption is that the number of JPs in 1700 is conditional on covariates orthogonal to future economic development. We're arguing this is true because the number of JPs at this time is determined by a range of historical factors. It's not by any means determined at random, but this is orthogonal to future growth. And we can highlight three different factors that I'll briefly explain to you. There's a lot of historical depth underlying this that, again, I can go into more in the Q&A. So the first is that the number of JPs is really historically persistent. So the number of JPs in 1550 very strongly predicts the number in 1700. And this is because in practice, the office of JP was quasi-hereditary. Once a family was appointed to be a justice, it was hard to remove that family from the bench because this was seen as a real insult. It was a removal of status. And so this means that once someone was appointed by a monarch in, say, the era of Henry VIII, it was hard for that family to be removed later. So this was one force that explains the number of JPs in 1700. Second, a critical constraint on the number of JPs was how many gentry were living in a county. So to be a JP, you had to be a member of the gentry. So if there were no gentry, you were limited in how many JPs you had. And third, there was a lot of political contestation after the Civil War, which led to an inflation in the number of JPs. So to go into some more depth, the way the JPs were being selected was through bargaining through the central government in the form of the Lord Chancellor and local magnates. So local magnates, most prominently the Lord Lieutenant, who was sort of the chief, the head of each county, would nominate potential elites to be JPs, and then the final decision was made by the Lord Chancellor. Importantly, though, because of this historical persistence element I mentioned before, the Lord Chancellor essentially could fiddle a little bit with the list of names, but they couldn't carry out whole-scale changes. So this is important in thinking about how the number of JPs in 1700 is shaped by this long historical process. Also important for our story is that in this period after 1660, the number of JPs is not being selected because of the value for economic activity. So reassuringly for what we're doing, by 1750, people in the counties realized JPs are important in helping the industrial revolution. But earlier than this, the historical literature is very clear that what's driving the number of JPs or appointments between 1660 and 1700, which is the date we use, is loyalty to new political parties who are contesting. And because of the difficulty of removing people from the bench, to gain control of a local bench, they would just appoint more JPs, stack the benches essentially. And this drives a process by which the number of JPs increases between 1660 and 1700. Arguably, the most important constraint, though, is what I term here a gentry constraint, which is the fact that JPs were nearly all drawn from the landed elite. They didn't have legal training. So in 1680, when we can identify this, around 56% of JPs were esquires, around 23% were baronets. So they were essentially lower level aristocracy, the baronets and the knights, or they were kind of high-end untitled elites, landed elites. So we think of this as kind of the old landed gentry. As I said before, their office accrued social status. The key factor here is that the location of elites is a key predictor of the location of JPs. And in particular, we see some evidence that actually counties essentially were running out of JPs, running out of elites. So at this point, nearly 30% of elites had been appointed as JPs, and this is in 1680. After this, the number of JPs grows further. And so in some counties, the percentage was much higher. Essentially, once a county had used up a lot of the eligible people, they just couldn't appoint more JPs. So counties in Wales had very, very few elites, and they were essentially limited in getting to the level of JPs that, say, Lancashire had. So with that in mind, for these reasons, we argue that the allocation of JPs in 1700 is not random, but it is orthogonal to future growth. So we're going to take this as saying that we can take the distribution of JPs in 1700 and interpret the relationship between that number and growth after 1700 as plausibly causal. We're going to be looking at the Industrial Revolution, thought of in a sort of Bob Allen sense as multiple reinforcing revolutions, so looking not just at economic development proxied by population density, but a range of other different outcomes, including both occupational change, urbanization, and innovation. So our headline results you can see in this table. So our independent variable here, so our dependent variable here is 1840 log population density. So this is economic development at county level in the mid-19th century. Our key variable of interest is log JPs in 1700. You can see here that there's a clear positive and statistically significant relationship between the number of JPs, legal capacity, and future and 1840 development. And this is controlling for 1700 development. So this is economic growth. You see, coal also has predictive power here. So this is reassuring, we're capturing something, but other controls don't. So the number of gentry critically does not predict future growth. We'll see more of this shortly. So although you might be concerned that the number of JPs is correlated with this, it seems to be being a JP that matters, not being a member of the gentry. Also, other factors such as the amount of political contestation, the area of the county, or the number of towns, none of these seem to predict economic development. What really matters is the number of JPs here. We can look at this in a more dynamic sense by using the fact that we can identify population density and also the number of patents at various points throughout the 17th and then the 18th centuries. So what this is showing you is a standard two-way fixed effects regression, where in each period I'm interacting the number of JPs in 1700 with the time period and looking at the impact over here on log population density, so which we think of as broad economic development, and over here on the number of patents, which is a measure of innovation. So on the left-hand side, we can see that over here, this is our headline result that we saw on the previous slide. We can see that, however, reassuringly, this effect begins to emerge in the first half of the 18th century, then looks like it grows a bit, potentially, sort of, it's not statistically significantly different, but maybe grows a bit, and then persists throughout the mid-19th century. So this means that we're not just capturing some factor that appears magically in 1840 and is consistent with the idea that maybe the sort of legal capacity in 1700 could kickstart a process of reinforcing relationships that leads to this gradual process of growth and a persistent head start for some counties. We can also see, similar to the chart I showed you earlier, we don't see any evidence of pre-trends. That is that counties with more JPs in 1700 didn't see faster economic development before 1700. So this is reassuring for our causal interpretation. On the right-hand side, we can see a very similar relationship, if slightly noisier, for the number of registered patents. So here I'm taking the number of registered patents in 20-year periods and seeing how these vary over time. Again, we see growth after 1700, peaking around 1800, then being persistent over time in the number of patents in a county. Again, there's little evidence of anything happening before 1700. So again, this is consistent with this reinforcing development story, that maybe we see economic growth, this drives innovation, this drives more economic development. So we can't pin this down, but this is consistent with this story. To give you some idea of how you should think about these estimates in terms of magnitude, what this means is that if Cumberland, which borders Lancashire, it's just in the northwest, it has similar access to coal, had the same number of JPs in 1700, it would have been around 30% bigger in terms of population by 1840. So then this is a kind of plausible estimate. If Cheshire, which is just south of Lancashire, and Lancashire swapped their JP stock, so Cheshire was more blessed with JPs, then we find that the Industrial Revolution would still have happened in Lancashire, i.e. Lancashire would still have grown more than Cheshire. So again, I think this is plausible. The story I'm telling you is not that the whole of the Industrial Revolution was driven purely by the existence of legal capacity, but the relative pace, having more access to the state, helped certain areas grow faster. Another way you could think of this is that a 1 standard deviation increase in log JPs has around an 80% of the effect size of a 1 standard deviation increase in the proportion of a county exposed to coal. So again, I think this is a large but credible estimate of the size of the impact of legal capacity. So we do various things, which I won't go through, where we control for a huge range of different political, economic, and geographic characteristics, in addition to the ones I showed you in the table. In case you're worried about that, I can talk about specific things later. We can also look at other outcome variables. So here I'm showing you the effect of log JPs on property income, financial development proxied by bank deposits, and the number of railway stations. We can also look at occupational change at county level. We see that at county level, more JPs is associated with more moves out of agriculture, more move into the tertiary sector, perhaps surprisingly, and this is something I want to return to, less movement at an aggregate level into the secondary sector, i.e. into industry. But we're going to see that this can be explained by the fact that the effect of JPs on movement into industry is conditional on access to coal. So to get at that point and to make some other nuanced points and also provide, I think, more credible evidence that this is a causal story, we're going to move away from county level analysis and look at town level results. So I'm now going to look at similar regressions, but the observations now will be the market towns I showed you in the map at the beginning. Our main variable of interest will again be log county JPs in most regressions, but we now have about 700 observations rather than 50, so I can control for a lot more things, pre-existing characteristics. We have a huge range of pre-existing economic and political characteristics. And now I can use the weaker identification assumption that the number of JPs at county level is exogenously determined relative to every single town in that county. And this is particularly plausible because towns were not the center of the economy in the 17th century. We can also look, and we're going to look at some regressions where I look directly at whether having a resident JP in a town was predictive of future growth. So the results are here. So here we're looking at the JPs in a county. This is the town population 1840. Again, I'm always controlling for the pre-existing level of development, or town population in this case, in 1680. And we can see that counties with more JPs saw faster growth in town population between 1680 and 1840. And so this is moving away from this broad impact on population density to something that looks more, I would say, like an industrial revolution outcome. We're seeing more town development or urbanization in counties with more JPs in 1700. Again, we see that having coal is important. Now we can also start adding controls for other things that might be interesting. So we add a bunch of things as controls, but I wanted to highlight a couple. First, we find that both stage towns, so towns on the railway, on the postal network, and also towns with self-governments, do grow faster as well during the Industrial Revolution period. This is not causal, these are sort of controls for us, but I think this is interesting in showing that other elements of what we might think broadly as state capacity seem to matter or potentially matter, but they don't disturb the coefficient on JPs. So we're capturing something separate to these other town level variables. We can also look over here at heterogeneous effects. So the most interesting one here, I think, is that if we interact the number of JPs with whether a town sat on an exposed coal field, we see that legal capacity was a much bigger driver of growth on towns with a coal field. And this is sort of plausible given the nature of the Industrial Revolution. Again, sort of fits with our story that the number of JPs could not be selected based on future growth. No one knew coal was going to be important in 1700. And shows, consistent with the story I've begun to tell you, that legal capacity can be really thought of as an accelerant, helping towns or areas take advantage of the opportunities arising during the Industrial Revolution. So we can look a little bit more at this by turning to data on the occupational structure of a town in 1851. So I'm staying at town level here. We have around 700 observations. And I'm looking at again, the share of occupations in agriculture, in the secondary sector, and the tertiary sector. As we saw at the county level, we see that having more JPs is associated with more move out of agriculture by 1851, and more move into the tertiary sector in 1851. Again, we see nothing going on in the secondary sector, or very little evidence of the secondary sector. But because we're looking at town level now, we can think more about maybe conditional effects. So again, I'm going to interact the number of JPs with whether a town sat in an exposed coalfield. As before, we see that actually the movement out of agriculture is stronger in towns which are on an exposed coalfield. And also, and sort of most interestingly for the Industrial Revolution, I would think that having legal capacity and having access to coal led to more movement into the industrial sector. So I interpret this as saying, well, the JPs couldn't come along and invent a steam engine, and the steam engine would be useless however many JPs you have if there's no coal. So conditional on having coal, though, legal capacity was helping towns or areas take advantage of these opportunities. Similarly, if we look at the tertiary sector, we see that towns with a harbour saw greater growth when they had JPs in the tertiary sector. So in a sense, the legal capacity, this is consistent with the legal capacity helping local economies be the best at whatever they were doing or whatever their strengths were. Finally, the final set of sort of town level results I want to talk about are these. And here I want to move away from thinking about county level JPs, although they are still here, and really focus on this variable at the top of this table. So the dependent variable in these tables is again 1840 town population. And now we're looking though at the presence of a local JP. So rather than looking at the whole county, we're saying, did you have a JP near you? And this is something that would plausibly be helpful for economic development, because this is an era, much of it before railways. So having a JP next to you meant that you could very easily access these local legal services I mentioned, means that you would have someone on hand to preempt or somehow disincentivize crime or counterfeiting like we saw before. And it would generally reduce the cost of accessing these services for people close to you. And we can see that actually this local element of legal capacity is predictive of future growth in town growth. These regressions also allow us to think about, well, is it really having a JP or is it having a member of the elite? So you might still be worried that it's something about the gentry driving our results. But we see that actually having just an aristocrat or a member of the gentry living in a town does not predict future growth. And this is true even if I remove the JP's variable, but you can't see this here. It's something very specific about having a member of the gentry who was also a JP. So this existence of a JP is doing something more than just being somehow important. This is supporting our argument that the channel here is that these gentry were legal capacity, they had these legal powers, not something to do with, for instance, their wealth. The other nice thing about this table is that, as well as showing us kind of this local impact of JPs, once we look within counties, we can include county fixed effects as well as all other controls. So this is adding further support to causal interpretation of our findings, because we see similar coefficients when we look within a county by including county fixed effects. So it's not that our results are driven by some factors that vary across counties. This is true even within a county. So together, I think this adds evidence of both the mechanism at play here, access to legal services was important, and also general support for the causal interpretation of greater legal capacity affecting economic development, and in this case, urbanization. So in the last few minutes, I want to talk about one final set of results, which is thinking a little bit more about how the JPs had this broad range of effects on occupational structure, economic development, innovation, etc. We can't pin this down. The JPs did too many things. The effect was too broad, and historical data is what it is. But we can look at two particular areas where we know the JPs were directly involved, where we might think they would have an effect directly, and also an effect that's relevant to economic development. The first is the JPs were really involved in the apprenticeship system, which is we can think of as a form of contract enforcement, but also key to the development of human capital at this point. So the JPs were responsible for policing the statute of artificers, and they were, as sort of Patrick Wallace has written, they were the main local agents of the state who were aiming to create this national skilled labor market. We can also look at the role of JPs potentially in shaping the size of local government, providing public goods through their role in quarter sessions managing county finances. So both of these are things which we would think matter to economic development, but they're also in a sense robustness tests, because we can think that, well, we should find that the JPs are affecting these things. If we can't, we might worry about why not? How could they be having an effect? So here in this final table, I'm back at county level, and we're looking as a dependent variable log expenditure on various things. So the number of log apprentices at county level, then log expenditure on poor relief, social insurance, criminal justice, the bridges, and highways. We can see that the number of log JPs positively affects all of these. So more JPs meant more apprentices, more human capital, and also more provision of social insurance and public goods such as criminal justice and infrastructure. This is looking at various different time periods, but again, looking up to essentially the late 18th or early 19th centuries. So this is consistent with important mechanisms, but we shouldn't see it as in any way comprehensive, but it's offering further support for the JPs being able to affect the economy. So I think I have like 1 or 2 minutes left. I'll just wrap up. So the story I told you today is that as Parliament started doing more things affecting the economy in the 18th century, they had to draw upon an ancient institution. That institution was the Justices of the Peace. Counties and towns had variation in whether they had these Justices of the Peace, and in a sense, as a result, how strong the state presence in those areas was. Places like Lancashire had a lot of these JPs, places like Wales had very few. And what we've seen is that this initial advantage in legal capacity led to this long-term development, long-term economic development in various ways. This is consistent with the theoretical idea that Tim and his co-authors have written out of self-reinforcing virtuous cycles between state capacity and economic growth. The sort of one lesson I would like you to take from this is that the state can play this important role in development even without a centralized bureaucracy. And maybe this is something that's particularly important in historical settings like the one we looked at here. In terms of where we fit into the literature, So we add to this empirical evidence of the contribution of state capacity to long-run economic development. So I think this is particularly in emphasizing the role of legal capacity, but also in providing this long-run analysis based on with sort of, we think, plausibly causal identification. We're emphasizing the role of the state during the Industrial Revolution period. And we've said this before, just to think directly about this point about how we fit into what I call here the Industrial Revolution debate. Say first that the role of legal institutions has been underestimated in many theories of the Industrial Revolution. But I think what we're seeing here is, in a sense, providing one explanation of why there's perhaps a little bit of ambiguity between this literature, which emphasizes Britain as having great institutions after the Glorious Revolution, and the fact that the real Industrial Revolution doesn't kick off till much later. And the reason is that both the state might be there with these good institutions, but some of these institutions are only present in certain areas and not in others. And it takes a while for this growth pattern to kick off. We've also seen that our results add an alternative channel through which the gentry may have shaped the Industrial Revolution, building on the work of Heldring et al., who emphasized the role of the gentry as providing commercialization. But we think, just to sort of a final point, although I've talked a lot, sort of both in the nature of the seminar and because of the nature of the paper about the Industrial Revolution in this period, then there's a broader lesson here, both in terms of the nature of state capacity, but also the nature of the legal capacity we're examining, which is that this unpaid, local level, street level legal enforcement is probably important in many different settings. And this is something which remains relevant today as well as in the past. So thank you very much, and thank you for coming, and I look forward to any questions you might have.
Okay, well, thanks so much. There are a number of questions in the queue. So I'll just start by there's a question. I mean, I guess I'll read it out. A question from Eugene White, which is, were there officers similar to JPs in other Northern European countries? And was there something distinctive about JPs that induced growth compared to, I guess, Belgium, which presumably one means the Austrian Netherlands, the Netherlands or France?
So I think I would say two things. First, we're not an expert on the comparative elements of this, and we shied away from making that. The historical literature, I had this quote from Landau, will tell you that this institution is unique, at least in Europe at this time. Over time, the JPs do spread to different areas, both within the British sort of empire and elsewhere. But I think one thing is that we would emphasize as being different probably about them than the structures in other states we are aware of, particularly France, is this autonomy I mentioned briefly, which is that they were these unpaid, untrained magistrates who, in a sense, were there to mediate disputes. And I think this was an advantage in the sense that when the state was providing bad laws or didn't know which sort of exactly how the law should work in this new, very rapidly changing environment, they had a little bit more flexibility to enforce the law in an appropriate way, adjusted for local circumstances. But we don't want to make the strong claim that this is sort of the different thing about Britain, because it's outside the area of our expertise. But I think there is an argument there that this is one reason, part of the story of why Britain was able to get ahead of the other Northern European countries.
Great. So there are two questions from Saka. One is, if the JPs are selected from local elites, does that not make your measure also a proxy of elite presence? And then why was harbor interaction not used in the table where dependent variable population is population? Should it not matter in that case?
So there's two different things going on here. So I'll take them in turn. So the first question about the local elites. So yeah, so we spend a lot of time thinking about the role between elites and JPs. So I think the important thing is we can control for both separately or look at both separately. So I don't think it's certainly not a proxy for elite presence because we can control for that and look separately. What I think is really interesting is in our data, we find very little predictive power of the presence of gentry in different ways. We can cut it up to different ranks, different things. So it doesn't look like the gentry matter. And I want to be a bit careful here in that the type of gentry we're looking at are landed gentry. So I think in the work by Leander, Heldring, and co-authors that I referenced before, they use a lot of commercialized gentry. What's interesting about the JPs is they're drawn really from this older type of landed gentry and not the full amount of gentry. So we're capturing one particular type of gentry. And so I think it's very plausible that this type of gentry didn't have particular relevance to the Industrial Revolution, just as being gentry, whereas others did through maybe commercial activities, etc. And I don't think they are being captured in the JP number. So the second question, why was harbor interaction not included in the table? So the main reason is just space. So there was a lot of columns going on. But the other reason is that I think the point about the harbor is it's something not necessarily about growing the town as a whole. It's about the nature of what's going on in the town. So I don't think necessarily you'd expect a huge effect on town population. From memory, I don't think we find one, but I honestly don't remember off the top of my head. But I think maybe underpinning that question is the question of why do we choose harbors? And I think that partly it's a reasonable point that there is a slight bit of we're trying to emphasize the kind of channels that might be going on. This isn't meant to be a complete test of every possible interaction you could think of. If you could think of something else a bit more akin to coal that you think we should include in that table, I'd really like to hear about it, actually. So I'd be open to suggestions.
Well, there are other questions in the queue, but I was sort of anxious to ask one of my own questions, and that has to be, I mean, there's one of the things that don't talk about. I'm largely persuaded by large parts of the argument.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things that I'm sort of not persuaded about is that the JPs remain unpaid and are informal in the 18th century. That is to say, I mean, one of the things that's sort of underestimated in the paper is how the nature of the justice of the peace is fundamentally transformed after 1685, right? I mean, you talk about the sort of growth of partisanship, but what goes along with that is over the course of the 18th century, JPs are increasingly selected for partisan reasons and also given places. So in other words, if you look at so you're technically right, of course, that the JPs are always unpaid, but by 1780, something like 85 to 90% of the JPs are also awarded places by the government in power, so they're effectively paid. And I guess what I'm wondering about is whether whether in fact there is such a difference between then the JPs and modern bureaucracy if they're in fact paid in fact indirectly agents of the state.
So that's really interesting. I'd love to know if you have. I didn't know this thing about the places, so I'd love to know about that. So I'm going to answer. If you can send me a citation or something, that's great. So I would say generally you're right though. We've moved away in the paper compared to earlier drafts and talking about what happens in the second half of the 18th century. Partly because we're focusing so much on trying to hopefully convince you that the number in 1700 is kind of not about growth. After 1750, what happens? I totally agree. That basically the JPs, they want them to become more like the modern state, and it doesn't work. And I hinted at that in the talk, but we don't talk much about that in the paper for reasons of space, really. But what I think you do see is exactly this. The JPs become overwhelmed. It stops being as effective. It can't keep up with the pace of the Industrial Revolution, essentially. And then in, I think, 1792, you see the first officially paid magistrates in Manchester. So I basically agree with everything you say, and I think I would like to write a sort of follow-up paper, which will be more about the evolution of this institution, because I think what you see is this works as a transitional institution, but I'm not trying to say that it was perfect through the Industrial Revolution.
Okay, let me return to questions from the queue.
Yeah.
So here, we have we have a question about is this a chicken and egg situation? That is to say, did the JPs lead on to the Industrial Revolution, or were the rise in JPs brought about by, I guess, by the Industrial Revolution, which needed to shape and manage economic development? Or sort of more broadly, I guess the question is did the JPs lead to economic change, or could you sort of see some sort of notion of the growth of the manufacturing sector leading to growth of JPs?
So I think both happen basically. So what you see, I mean, you can't see it in the paper or as it exists or in the presentation today, but the number of JPs do continue to increase in the 18th century. And I would definitely argue that that's partly sort of similar to the answer to Stephen's question, a reaction to the Industrial Revolution. People need JPs because of the Industrial Revolution, they get more JPs. What's key to argument, I think, is that JPs in 1700 are not driven by the Industrial Revolution. This is not a point when you see that growth is at least noticeably increasing and leading to an increase in the number of JPs. So I showed you some evidence of that. We can control for a lot of things to try and get at that. fundamentally, we don't have a natural experiment that proves that, but that's the argument we're trying to make. So I think essentially, very consistent actually with the theoretical work on this, the number of JPs in 1700 or 1680 is somewhat orthogonal to future growth. But then you do see this sort of reinforcing cycle where you get growth, you get more JPs, you get more growth, you get more JPs. Essentially, then you run out of JPs. So what starts happening actually after 1760 is because they ran out of elites, they have to start using vicars as JPs who are probably not as effective. That's what the historical literature would tell you. And that's when you start getting new forms of state capacity. That was the whole question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's another couple of questions here. So one says, most recent studies of productivity point to the start of productivity growth before 1688. So in that case, are JPs really appearing before the start of growth? I guess sort of asking questions about, are you able then to sort of see JPs as the causal mechanism?
Yeah, so I mean, I agree. I'm not contending with so I agree with the premise of the question. Then there is now evidence that growth was beginning to exist before 1700. What's key to us is that I think it's taken about 200 years for economic historians to notice this, and so I don't think people at the time understood it. And in that sense, I think that's important because what we need to argue is that the JPs were not being selected for this basis. In fact, I think one way you can interpret our paper, and I think I would be close to interpreting this way, is things were changing in the economy at a kind of macro level in the 18th century, maybe feeding from the 17th century. But they had bigger effects in areas with more JPs because these opportunities existed and JPs could help areas take advantage of that. This would be problematic for us if the number of JPs in 1700 was shaped by those trends. I don't think it was, and that's what I was trying to argue. To the extent we can test for it, we see that there's no relationship between pre-trends in urbanization, pre-trends in population density and the number of JPs. You can question whether we don't have local level like productivity data, of course. So we don't see any evidence of this, and I think this is very consistent with the historical literature there.
Okay. So here's another question asking, I mean, the story, the mechanisms that you test for are ways in which, JPs have a sort of what they do. They're enforcing the law has a positive effect on growth. And this question says, well, before 1700, there were many laws which were actually unfriendly to growth. I guess the question is, could JPs also have negative effects, or having more JPs have negative effects?
Yes. So I think in early initiation versions of this paper, and maybe also today, I often got criticized as being a bit too much of a champion for the JP. They could certainly do things in principle that were not helpful to growth. So to some extent, this is an empirical question. I would say our results support that they didn't. I think, so that's one element of it. I think we should sometimes be careful that there were things that sometimes they would do that might seem like rent-seeking for their class, but might still be good for growth. So for instance, if you stifle worker revolts, this might not be great for the workers, but could still be important for growth. I think actually though, and this is a bit more, this is based on the historical literature, I can't prove it to you quantitatively. I think like one of the answers I gave earlier is this is where the JPs were perhaps their flexibility was useful because at times, and there are definitely historical examples of this, if the law seemed like it would really stifle the local economy, they could just kind of ignore the law or interpret in a way that was helpful. And so this gave them some flexibility in doing that. But I by no means want to say that everything a JP ever did was positive for growth. I think we're seeing the overall pattern here as that. And I think to go sort of another way you could interpret our results compared to what I told you earlier, is that the other thing that changed in the 18th century is maybe the laws get better, because Parliament is getting better at what it does. This would be the kind of glorious revolution style story that Dan Bogart argued in one of his previous papers. And this is what's changing. The law is becoming better, but how well that law works is then constrained by the number of JPs.
So here we have a question is, could pre-1700 JPs, the number of pre-1700 JPs correlated to topography, that is to say, river navigation, future canals, or to population mobility, which may contribute to future regional economic growth? As much as this was the case, were you able to control for these variables?
Let me just check if I have the table. I don't think I have the right figure here. No. So I was just saying we can't, so what we can look at, sorry, I just messed this up now. What we can, so I can't remember whether they correlated with topography. What I can tell you is that I don't think so, and we control for those things, river navigation and future canals. I don't think they correlated with that, but they're definitely not correlated that after we control for like the access to coal and coordinates, essentially. Population mobility, we can also control for the change in population, which isn't quite the same. So I don't think we have pre-data on either vagrancy or poor laws before the 1700. If you have ideas of where we could get that data, I'd be very happy to have it, to look at it. We can look at earlier economic development in various forms, and we control for that, and that doesn't make any difference to our results, essentially. So in general, I think we can control for those factors, and we have done. I don't have anything specifically on vagrancy and the poor law, and I would be happy to control for it if there's suggestions of how we could do it.
Great. Here's another question that I inadvertently skipped over, which is, could it not be that what we're seeing as a correlation that may not necessarily show causality in the direction you specify, but in fact a new business environment which required more legal cases and therefore more JPs?
So I think my answer to this would be similar to the question earlier, that for sure this happens, but I think it happens after 1700, because this is when these new business environments begin to emerge. And we see this actually, this is what I didn't have time to talk about, but we see this in the laws and also the duties that JPs were given in the 18th century. That over the 18th century, we see that new kind of industries turn up. So coal shows up in 1830 or something, and these duties for the JPs. And so definitely what the JPs are meant to be doing was reacting to this. And you see after 1760, counties do start asking for more JPs to deal with essentially economic issues, administrative issues. But this doesn't happen until after 1750. So for our story, that doesn't matter for our causal story, but it does, of course, matter for understanding the history of the institution of the JPs. I'm not exactly sure what, I didn't run a Granger causality test, but I'm not exactly sure which one you have in mind. To some extent, I should say, I guess because we don't have very fine-grained temporal data, it's not obvious to me what we could run either. But yeah, I'd be happy to answer in more detail if you tell me what you have in mind.
Okay, we have just 3 more minutes. Since there's no other questions in the queue, let me just ask another question. So I mean, there's been this kind of growing literature on the importance of the relationship between petitioning campaigns and the proliferation of economic legislation in the 18th century. So sort of mapping Julian Hoppett's early work to sort of the work of sort of more social historians. And I guess what I'm sort of wondering is whether some of this might put pressure on the mechanisms that you specify in the paper. That is to say, in the written version of the paper, you say that JPs are particularly good for enforcing property rights and for enforcing contracts. And in fact, you test for contracts in the presentation. But I'm wondering, in fact, whether there's another mechanism. I mean, you talked about testing for infrastructure, but I'm wondering whether the mechanism of the proliferation of MPs, to the extent that they're correlated increasingly with partisan politics, might also the mechanism might be that having more JPs in a locality might lead to more legislation being passed by Parliament, which could then create the infrastructure. In other words, that JPs, I mean, because JPs are absolutely central in organizing petitioning campaigns.
So let me check. So you're suggesting that basically because you have more JPs in the county, this essentially helps them organize petitions, and then you might get like local acts of Parliament or something that would help your county, something like this. Is that?
Yes, I mean, they did organize petitions, and the petitions did increasingly call for economic legislation.
Yeah. So I think so. So the short answer is yes. I think that is another plausible mechanism. So I hadn't thought of this exactly in the sense of petitions for these acts, but we do see, and and maybe this is actually an example of this. Like there's an example in the West Riding of Yorkshire where the JPs basically lobby Parliament to get a register made of land transactions, which helps exactly so you can have loans. And so I see this kind of bottom to top as part of the institution of the JPs that could work. And in fact, that's interesting. I hadn't linked that exactly to the number of JPs, but it makes sense what you say. And I agree. I think the complexity of this institution is it does so many things that it's hard to pin down any one of them. But yeah, that's a very interesting point. Thank you. I think we should highlight the connect because I hadn't thought of this as the number of JPs mattering, but you're right. Having more JPs allows you to do more of this, and that's a thing that we can add point to in the paper. So if you have specific citations on that, that would be really helpful, actually.
Yeah. Okay, so at this point, we're supposed to end the formal proceedings and pivot to the informal proceedings. But before I do that, I just wanted to announce the next paper in this series, which will be on the 14th of May with Andrea Bernini from Oxford presenting a paper, Enslaved and Enslavers Turned Educators, Teacher Identity and Black Achievement. So now we can pivot to the sort of more informal discussion. Is there a new... Oh, no, yeah. I got Ron Harris's question, I think. Okay. Yeah.
I have a barge in. I have a question to Jonathan. Thank you for the presentation. So yeah, everybody's asking you, and I think that's and we heard this paper a few days ago as well, last week, on this causality issue, which so, and also in terms of kind of seeing what the contribution of the JPs to the economic growth industrialization of England is. So I guess those JPs were not assigned randomly before 1700, and definitely not the number of them was related to the expected level of disputes or the value of these disputes or whatever. You wouldn't put 10 JPs in a place where nobody lives and there's no dispute. So although they really wanted the titles and everything, but still you would think that that would be some correlation between the pre-existing number of JPs and the level of economic activity, the complexity of economic activity, etc. And that thing tends to be persistent throughout time. So if you look at some of your regressions, so I guess in the baseline, for instance, you look at population in 1700 or 1680 versus 1830 or 1840, I don't remember the numbers, the coefficient is almost 1. So so there is this persistence in terms of, so would it be more, I mean, I think in terms of seeing what the contribution of JPs is that given the prosperity of these regions, given the fact that this, and so they actually facilitated or made the implementation of the Industrial Revolution in various aspects smoother rather than actually caused it or prompted it, or so it's kind of maybe a necessary condition, maybe, but definitely not a sufficient or a causal condition in terms of once you have them, then you would have this. So I was looking more, so it's more about, and these developments, I guess, and that's part of the nice thing about the argument, I think, in relating it to the larger debate of the role of the Glorious Revolution, is that this infrastructure predates the Glorious Revolution in many ways. So the seeds of what could have facilitated the industrialization and the economic growth in England were already sown earlier in those regimes that people kind of think were bad or something. And they were given quite a lot of independence back then as well in terms of the way they structured. And I take your point about the French. They had local magistrates, but these were mainly employed by the crown and more tightly controlled by the central government. So that's a comment or a question or whatever.
Yeah, so thank you very much. And thank you for listening to this twice in a week as well. So I would say, so I totally agree. Like my interpretation of this or these results is I don't think the JPs caused the Industrial Revolution in a sort of broad sense. I think I like the term that someone used to me, like an accelerant. Having this institution helped accelerate it. And to the extent that I think I read an interview by Greg Clark recently, and I think most people would agree now, like Northern Europe was the special area. Britain just happened to get there a bit first. And maybe the JPs are part of the reason for that. I think that's a plausible interpretation of our results. But that's why I really like these results with the coal and the industrial and the secondary sector unemployment. I don't think the JPs show up. And if I was saying that just having a JP made you build like a secondary sector, that would be hard to, I wouldn't exactly know what to make of that. But the fact that they help you take advantage of access to these resources, I think makes sense. And to me is quite a plausible thing that could happen, that these guys were there. They were by no means there randomly, but you didn't have them, you were still constrained. And it was difficult to come back from that. And I think the other nice thing about our paper, actually, that I didn't mention today, is that if you look at the pattern of where the JPs are, they fit with the overall prediction of where, or the overall knowledge of where the Industrial Revolution happened in Britain. So I think some previous quantitative studies you sometimes have, for instance, like where the monasteries were, for instance, if we look at the dissolution of the monasteries, it's not that they're all in Lancashire. Whereas we see JPs in the areas that grew, like in Lancashire and Middlesex, and not in the areas that didn't, like in Wales. And I think this is reassuring from a macro level, of course, that, you know, comes with all the caveats about causation and identification and stuff. But I think in the broad picture, it fits with that. And I think it fits with the idea of the state facilitating what's going on here. And in a sense, that's consistent with the idea the state just didn't get in the way, but also that you still need the state there because the state is doing something. And I think that can be easily overlooked when we get so used to thinking about markets working, that these basic functions need to be provided by somebody. And that's what the JPs were doing. So I'm not sure if that answered exactly what you were saying, but I hope so.
Thanks.
So I have more questions. I'm still, I mean, because I mean, it strikes me that you make an argument. I mean, you say, look, partisanship, I mean, which you're absolutely right. I mean, this is the stuff that Glassy showed a long time ago, is that partisanship does lead to a sort of a growth of JPs in particular regions. But you seem to assume that partisanship is not related to economic programs. So what happens? I mean, so there's been a lot of recent literature emphasizing the centrality of political economic programs to the growth of partisanship in Britain. I mean, in England in the 17th century. That is to say, the Whigs had a particularly pro-manufacturing stance, for example. So I guess what I'm sort of wondering is whether there's some relationship between the pre-1688 growth of MPs and partisan economic programs. I think you're muted. I think you're muted.
Sorry. Yeah. So what I was saying was, I'm happy to be corrected on the details of the 17th sort of century politics, because I think this is like more Dan's speciality than mine. But what I can tell you is in the data, we don't see much relationship between like these measures of political factors, like how strong the Whig presence was in the county, like in Parliament, or votes for the exclusion crisis, for instance, and like the JPs. So we don't see evidence of that. We do see that contestation matters. Like the fact that you have both there, like the Whigs and the Tories, and they're having elections, that predicts the number of JPs or the growth in JPs. So empirically, we don't see a lot of evidence of that. I think you're right that
my data shows something. I mean, the stuff that I published suggests something somewhat different, but we can talk about that.
No, I mean, this would be great because I would accept, and I would like to improve the part of the paper that talks exactly about this issue in the depth. So suggestion, yeah, I would love to talk more about that, because I think that is the one thing that I would say one thing, so we can talk about that, but one thing we have in the paper, which is if what you're worried about is the causal identification side of this, which is not the only thing that's interesting, is we do have this instrument where we use the number of 1550 JPs to instrument the number of 1700 JPs. So that should isolate this historic part of the JPs being created. And so from a causal identification point of view, even we rely on that and not rely on this growth that might happen, we still get similar results. So I sort of doesn't worry me in one sense, but I think it's also important to understanding what's happening. So I'd really like to talk more about it from someone who knows more than me.
Other questions?
Yes, there's a couple of raised hands by David Mitch and Federico Gonzalez. I can unmute David to begin with. David?
Okay, now can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. So I find it convincing. I guess one quibble I have is whether the JP should be seen as reflecting the state as such, or more broadly could be seen as reflecting the aspects of civil society, sort of in Hegelian type terms. And a related issue I'm wondering about is in areas like Wales where there aren't so many JPs, presumably there were substitutes at work and they weren't working as well as JPs and sort of resolving those things, but that also could be viewed as elements of civil society. So I'm just would be interested in your reactions to those issues of interpretation.
Yeah, so I agree. We've struggled a lot in exactly how to interpret the JPs. And so I don't think we can hard and fast say this is a pure measure of legal capacity, because this is something about, at some point, just the fact that they're doing something and the JPs exist is something about, I think what Tim might call collective capacity or something like this. So I think that's one aspect of it. I do think the fact that they're so entwined with the law is important. And that's related to your second question, which is there are other legal bodies going on that can do various things the JPs can do to some extent. So for instance, in Wales, we have this example in the paper from Wales. They have this issue, there's no JPs, so they can't maintain the highways. Now, in principle, like parishes can actually do this themselves, but it's more difficult for the parishes because they don't have the powers the JPs do, and they can't draw on the funds from the whole county. So in this sense, a lot of what the JPs are capturing is something about the powers being given to them by Parliament. More broadly with like dispute resolution. I mean, there are other courts in England, like manor courts and borough courts and things like this, but they don't quite have the powers the JPs do, and they don't have the range of jurisdiction the JPs do or the flexibility. And so they're just not as good. So it's not a question of like JPs or the Wild West. It's kind of JPs or something which is not as effective.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay. So Rui says that we've gone through all the questions. So
Okay.
So thanks very much, Jonathan. And
Thank you very much.
And nice to meet you. And yeah, we should email exchange because I have a bunch more questions which I can I'll send you.
Yeah, and I'd love to know. I mean, obviously, I'd love your direct comments, but also just specific things to go and read that you mentioned would be really helpful, because we are trying to strengthen this, and I think particularly on this, this question about that you raised about the connection in the wigs and the manufacturer and this stuff seems like something we should really know more about than we do. So I'd love to hear about that, and also your other points, of course. So thank you very much. And thank you for reading the paper as well as chairing. So
thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Rory and Nathan,
everybody,
for organizing, and Jamila. Thank you.
Keep well. Bye.
Thank you,
everybody. Bye bye. Bye bye.
Thanks, Steve.